NIT University. As you all might know by now, Mr. Karl Malmuth is a public domain activist and he's founder of publicresource.org, which is an NGO which publishes US government data online. And his battle in life is to make public information actually public, that is freely available for everyone. His work is quite relevant to us, considering the fact that we use a lot of case laws, legislative materials, orders, notifications, rules, so on and so forth, which should be freely available to us at all times. Currently, he's also at loggerheads with the Indian government because he secured some safety orders from Bureau of Indian Standards and published them online for free to let everyone have them. And yeah, without wasting anyone else's time, I would like to invite Mr. Karl Malmuth on the podium and tell us all about his endeavors and Satyagre as he sees it.
Agarwal and Nikhil Purohit. Did I totally butcher your names? Yes. Sorry about that. I want to talk to you about access to knowledge and kind of my discovery of India, if you will, about how I ended up working here in India. I'm spending all of August in the country. I'll be spending all of October, all of December, and devoting a lot of effort in India for the next couple of years. And I'd kind of like to explain why I'm doing this and how I got there. I was actually trained as an economist. I was doing my PhD work in antitrust economics and regulation, so social control of business. How do you make business serve a common good? And I got all the way up to my PhD dissertation, finished all my classwork, and my topic was the convergence of computers and telecommunications. This was about 1980. And it looked to me like these things were going to become one and the same. There would be a global network. Everybody could communicate with everybody else. But that was kind of a radical idea at the time. A few people were talking about it. And I thought I should know a little bit more about computers if I was going to be writing about them. And so instead of teaching microeconomics to business students, I went over to the computing center and worked as a consultant. And I ended up dropping out of my PhD program. Now, I don't recommend this to you. I had 6 more months I could have had my PhD and I would have been finished. But I spent the time learning about databases and computer networks. I helped put Indiana University on the internet. I went to Washington, D.C., worked for the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and helped revamp the way they did the money supply. And as part of that, I did a year in law school. I did the night program at Georgetown Law, and I did a year there, and again, I dropped out. Computers were really beginning to take off, and I spent the next decade writing books about computer networks. I did half a dozen in-depth books. I did a 3-volume professional reference series, did a lot of looking at databases like Ingress, which you probably don't know about today, but you may have heard of Postgres. There's a whole series of databases out there. By the end of the 80s, I began to see the internet, TCP/IP, as the one network that was going to rule them all. It was clear this was going to happen. The network was still pretty small. There was a file you could pull up that had a list of all the computers on the internet. It was called the host.txt file. And you could actually pull it up. It was, maybe a couple thousand computers. And if you were looking to send mail to someone, you'd know they were at, Indiana University. You'd pull up the file and figure out the name of the Indiana University computer, and then you'd try to get email to them if you could. So I was doing the books, and I finally decided I wanted to get my hands on some more. I had begun working in the Internet Engineering Task Force, which was a volunteer group of people that was making standards available to anybody, and the IETF built the protocols that our current internet works on, and I enjoyed that very much. I began to see audio and video starting to happen in a very experimental way, and I decided to start a radio station. So I started the first radio station on the internet, doing what we now call podcasting and live streaming and things like that. In those days, Live streaming was very hard. You actually, if you wanted to do live streaming of video, you needed to send a note out to the internet list, the Internet Engineering Task Force, and say, I'm going to be doing video next Tuesday. And so you kind of have to reserve the internet in order to be able to do video. When I first put the Congress online with audio, somebody complained on the IETF list, and they said, well, look, if you put Congress online, pretty soon every parliament in the world is going to want to be on the internet. Like it was a bad thing. Vince Cerf, by the way, intervened and said, this is not a bad thing, this would be good. As part of running that radio station, we did a big demo for the United States Congress, not just me. Me, Sun Microsystems, demonstrated cell phones and video and audio and all those things. And at the end, I was called back to Chairman Markey's office. Chairman Markey, he's now a U.S. Senator, had oversight over telecommunications, but also over finance. And he had a note from Ralph Nader's Raiders saying the Securities and Exchange Commission EDGAR database should be on the internet for free. Now the EDGAR database is where public corporations file their filings. So when Google IPO'd, they had to file with the SEC. Every year, every corporation has to do annual and quarterly reports. It's what makes our markets transparent and efficient in the United States, at least in theory. And they wanted to know why this EDGAR database wasn't online. And the system that the SEC had in place was the idea that the data was raw and needed value added, and so they wholesaled the data to a vendor. And the vendor wholesaled the data to other vendors like Dow Jones and Disclosure, and they sold these documents, pardon me, they sold those documents for $20 or $30 each. Expensive. Not available for free. Unavailable if you were a student. Unavailable if you were a journalist. You had to go to your boss and say, I need $500 because I need to buy a bunch of annual reports. And so I looked at it, and I decided this was a very doable proposition. And I went back into the chairman's office with the chief of staff, and the SEC were there, and I said, this should be available for free on the internet. And the SEC Information Technology Deputy Director looked at me and said, well, I just don't think the internet has the right kind of people. And I couldn't help myself. I said, I think the American people are the right kind of people. At which point my colleague kicked me and said, behave. And what I ended up doing was getting a grant from the National Science Foundation. So I got a grant from the American people to buy data from the American government to give back to the American people. We put this on the internet. The World Wide Web was a new thing that I didn't believe was really going to work at the time, so we used Gopher and FTP. We had a little search engine so you could actually search these things, and then the web happened and we put in a web server, and I ran it for 2 years. And my goal was that not that I would be in the EDGAR business, it was that the government would be in the EDGAR business. And so I put a sign up on our website that said, this service will terminate in 60 days. And I published our source code. I published our usage statistics, case studies that said, look, this isn't a bunch of Wall Street fat cats that can afford this. This is senior citizen investment clubs and journalists and students and a whole bunch of people using this information. Our source code, our stats, and then at the bottom there was a series of links. It said, click here to send mail to Al Gore, Vice President of the United States, and he had email. Click here to send mail to Newt Gingrich, the Speaker of the House, who also had email. Click here to send mail to the chairman of the FCC. The chairman didn't have email, so I set up an account for him. We got 17,000 messages for the chairman. Please keep this online. This is incredibly valuable. I really need this. So we printed all 17,000 messages out, big stack of paper, walked them down to the SEC, got a meeting with the chairman and the commissioners, and we were able to talk with them. And I learned something, that when you're dealing with the information technology people, their position was that putting EDGAR on the internet would expose the data to viruses, which is, of course, total nonsense. These were text documents. You can't put viruses in a text document, but their position was this was a bad thing. The chairman realized they were not in the business of selling $20 documents. They were in the business of making the markets efficient and transparent. He called the Wall Street Journal that night and said, we're going to put the EDGAR database on the internet. So this is great. The next day I got a call from the chief of staff saying, well, you might have seen the chairman call the Wall Street Journal, but we have a problem. I said, well, what's your problem? Well, the problem is we can't do anything in 60 days. There's just no way. Can you extend your deadline? And I said, no, we're not going to extend our deadline. But here's what we can do. And so I loaned them our computers. We put them in a station wagon, drove them down to the SEC. They had an internet link, but it wasn't working, and so we fixed their internet link. We got them up and running, and they were there. And then something magical happened. The computer staff realized they were now running the most popular internet service in the entire federal government, and they got incredibly proud. And not only that, they were able to go to their bosses and say, well, you know, we've got a loaner computer, but we've got to do this right. And so they were able to buy all these really big 8-processor Sun Microsystems server boxes. And so they had all these great toys to play with. They were running the most popular service in the federal government. They got to go to conferences and give PowerPoint presentations. They became huge fans of the system. They loved it. We had a little extra money from the NSF. And so I went ahead and bought the patent data as well, which were delivered on these tapes that you had to process. But the patent office was making $40 million a year selling patents. And the commissioner just totally objected, and it took us another 10 years before the patent database finally got online for real. It was more longer to do one of these fights. In 2007, I had been Chief Technology Officer for John Podesta at the Center for American Progress. John was Bill Clinton's Chief of Staff. He was a senior advisor to President Obama. He was Hillary's campaign chair. But this was a period when they were out of power and he had started this new think tank. And so I'd spent a couple of years with him getting his computers fixed, but also doing some tech policy work on net neutrality and things of that sort. And I finally decided that I couldn't do that within the auspices of the Center for American Progress, because every time I went and spoke to like a government official, they thought I was there as part of some plot to get Hillary Clinton elected president. They thought it was some partisan thing. And so I told John that I was leaving and going off the center to start a new nonprofit called public.resource.org. And I decided to focus on the law, because the law was just not available. You could not get any U.S. Court of Appeals opinions on the internet. There were a few modern ones. Some courts were publishing their new decisions, but if you had some 1960 Court of Appeals decision, it just wasn't there. And so I started this new nonprofit, and with my friend Larry Lessig, we were able to come up with $600,000, and we bought the back file of the Court of Appeals and we put it online. And that was the first time the Court of Appeals opinions were available. I discovered something, by the way, when we posted the Court of Appeals decisions. I started getting calls from people saying, you have my social security number on your website. And it turns out the Court of Appeals had been a little bit sloppy and had been putting social security numbers in some of their opinions. So we helped redact all of those and notified all the clerks of the courts so that they could redact their versions of the things. We did a few other things besides the law. I sent a bunch of volunteers into the National Archives, which had all these amazing videos. The archivist let me bring in duplicators, and so we duplicated 6,000 videos and put them on YouTube. Got 75 million views so far on that channel. Just some amazing video that they've cut. You know, how to fix a Jeep, how electricity works, just, you know, stuff from the Army, stuff about agriculture and pesticides, historical films, just amazing stuff that was just laying fallow. Put congressional video online. I thought hearings from congressional hearings should be available, the video, and it wasn't. Or if it was these little bitty videos, you know, Windows Media, just totally awful, and you couldn't download them. I had written a report to Speaker Pelosi saying you should do a better job. When Speaker Boehner got into power, whenever politicians get in power on day one, they always want to do something that shows that they're with the people. So it's always some kind of a transparency thing. And so the first thing Speaker Boehner did was sent me a letter and asked me to work with the House Oversight Committee to put video from them online. Now, these are very conservative people. John Boehner and Chairman Issa was chairman of the House Oversight Committee. He's about to retire, but you know, he's a strong Trump supporter, conservative Republican. My issues are very nonpartisan, so I very much work across the aisle. something kind of funny happened on that one. So I worked with the committee. It was great. They gave me high definition video from each of their hearings as they occurred. I got the transcripts from them, which was unheard of because transcripts usually took a year to come out. And we use those to do closed captioning. So we put the videos on YouTube, we bounce the transcripts into YouTube, and we get time-aligned subtitles back. So it was the first time the Congress was actually accessible video. As part of my deal, I was able to do the archives of the House Oversight Committee. And so I went to the House Broadcast Studio and said, hi, I have a letter from the Speaker of the House. I have rights to the prior videos. And they were like, we're really busy, we just don't have time. And I said, well, maybe I can help you. So it's in a professional format. And so maybe, let me look at it. So they gave me a Blu-ray disc, and there was an MPEG-2 transport stream on it. And so I called them back up and said, yeah, I can read this. And so they Federal Expressed me a binder that had 50 Blu-rays in it. And I opened the binder, and it had, House Oversight. And then I looked at the next one, and it said House Judiciary. And then the next one said House Commerce Committee. And I realized these binders had the entire Congress in them. And so I went out and I bought 6 Blu-ray readers. And I copied them as quickly as I could. I ripped them, and I FedExed back the binder, and I called them up, and I said, I'm done. Do you have any more? Oh, yeah, we got lots. And so all summer they kept sending me these binders. And I ripped them as quick as I could. And then I went to Washington, and I'm done with the binders. Do you have anything else? Oh, we have some disk drives in the corner. And so I took the disk drives and copied them. And I ended up with 14,000 hours of video from all the committees. Now, the congressional policy is up to each chairman to decide whether or not to release video from their hearings. And so I ended up in this meeting in the Speaker's office with their general counsel, and I said, well, it appears that you sent me the entire Congress by mistake. That's not going to be a problem, right? Because there's no copyright over works of the United States government in the U.S. That's Section 105 of the U.S. Copyright Act. And they were like, at which point the chairman of the Committee on House Administration cut me off at the knees, no more video for you. But I have a very nice archive from 2002 to about 2011. And that's all up on the Internet Archive. Much of it is closed caption. I was able to get the transcripts from the government printing office and throw them in there. Unfortunately, the Library of Congress came in as kind of a turf thing, and they decided this was their job, and they did a really bad streaming solution. In theory, they're archiving all the videos, but I'm not convinced, and they're certainly not releasing the archive. So, that was kind of a half a win, half a not win. And so that's the law. We did some other things with respect to the law. I worked with my friend Aaron Schwartz and Steve Schultz, and we downloaded a whole bunch of PACER documents using a public trial. Courts called the FBI on us. They thought they had been hacked. They hadn't been hacked. They just had a really bad system. I ended up in a meeting with 2 FBI agents and said, well, look, I know they were surprised we got 20 million pages, but it's not a crime to surprise a bureaucrat, but that's just the way it is. We found a lot of privacy violations in those documents, and I sent a formal audit to 32 chief judges of the district courts. They've made minor changes in their privacy policies. The idea that PACER should be open and free, we've gotten nowhere on that one. It's still 10 cents a page. There are some good systems like courtlistener.com, which I would highly recommend if you want district court opinions and dockets and even appellate. That's based on the archive we initially started with, and Mike Lisner now runs that system, has done a really nice job putting that one together. So that's kind of the law, but when I was doing that, I noticed there was a special kind of law that was not available, and that's become my focus for the last 10 years. In the United States, our safety codes, building codes, electrical codes, fire codes, transportation of hazardous materials, testing for lead in water, are all developed by private organizations, and then they're incorporated into law by reference. So the National Electrical Code is in fact the law on how you do electrical wiring in all 50 states and in federal law, but it's developed by the National Fire Protection Association, which asserts copyright over that document. And their theory is they need the money in order to develop high quality codes. Now they need the money. These are all nonprofits, but they're nonprofits that pay their CEOs $2 million a year. And in fact, the last CEO that left ASTM, the American Society for Testing and Materials, had not only been paid like $1.5 million a year, he got a $5 million payout when he left office. So these are very rich nonprofits. There was a 2004 Fifth Circuit decision called the Beck Decision. Pete Beck, a guy in Texas, had bought the model code that was the Texas building code and had posted it on the internet, and it was sued, viciously sued. U.S. District Court litigation is just awful. And it broke him. I mean, it cost a lot of money. But he finally got a decision from the Fifth Circuit, an en banc decision, no less, with Edith Jones, who was a Ronald Reagan appointee, very conservative. And their opinion said the model code perhaps had copyright as a private work, but the Code of Texas did not, because in the United States the law does not have copyright because it belongs to the people. That goes all the way back to Wheaton v. Peters in 1824, when a reporter for the Supreme Court wanted to assert copyright over the opinions that he had published on their behalf, and the Supreme Court said, no, the law belongs to the people in the United States. So there's long-standing common law precedent. It's called the Edicts of Government Doctrine, that says statutes and regulations and court opinions do not have copyright in the United States. Now that's different from the Works of Government Clause. The Works of Government Clause says works of the federal government do not have copyright. That's a statutory exception to copyright. The Edicts of Government Doctrine is a common law doctrine that says the law at any level does not have copyright. Now, despite the Beck decision, there were no building codes on the internet in 2007. And so I read that very carefully, and I thought about it, and I bought the California codes, which cost $1,000. Electrical, building, fire, plumbing, fuel and gas, elevator safety, mechanical safety, environmental energy efficiency, the technical laws that govern how you do business in California. And if you violate those laws, you go to jail. If you're an electrician and you do shoddy installations, that is a violation. You lose your license. It is the law. And so I bought those and I posted them on my site, on the Internet Archive. We spent a lot of time retyping many of these codes into HTML, redrawing the diagrams into SVG. You could make them bigger and smaller and paste them into your Word document, recoding the formulas, making them accessible to the visually impaired. And so after I did California, I kind of sat back a little bit, took a deep breath. Nothing happened. I wasn't sure anybody had noticed. And so I went and bought the rest of the codes for the United States that were incorporated at the state level. All the electrical, building, plumbing, all these codes, and I posted them online. In 2012, I decided to take it to the next level. The federal government incorporates by reference technical standards, hazardous materials, safety of ladders used in factories, personal protective equipment for firefighters. These are all federal safety codes in the Code of Federal Regulations. There's a very deliberate and careful process. If an agency wants to incorporate a standard by reference, they need to publish a notice of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register, our official gazette. There is a comment period. There's a final notice of proposed rulemaking. It needs to be approved by the director of the Office of the Federal Register. It is a notice is put into the Code of Federal Regulations. Everybody agrees these are the law. Everybody does. And so I started scouring the Code of Federal Regulations, looking for the standards that are incorporated by reference. Now, I was very careful. Sometimes standards are mentioned, right? You know, it's like, oh, you might want to look at this for information. That's not the law. But if that special language is in there, it's saying incorporated by reference by order of the director of the Office of the Federal Register, then it is the law. Many of these standards were simply not available to purchase. The government is slow. So some of these were 1967 standards that were still on the books. The standards organization maybe has a 2012 version of that standard, but they don't sell the old ones anymore. So I had to go on eBay, I had to go on the Amazon used book market, I went to friendly librarians and said, "Here, can I borrow this from your library and make a copy of it?" Because many libraries won't let you copy these codes. You say, "Oh, no, that's copyright, you can't have it." Federal government has a copy in the Office of the Federal Register and one other copy in a reading room for the agency. But in many cases, the agency can't find the thing. And with the Coast Guard, I said, "Hello, I'd like to come in and look at some of the standards that are the law." And they said, "Well, you can do that, but you can't bring a camera in and you can't copy them unless you have permission from the standards body." So the position was that you need permission from a private party before you could access the law. So I did about 1,000 of the standards incorporated by reference into the Federal Register. And then we started to hear from the standards development organizations. We had a minor suit at first, and we were very poorly prepared, and they ended up dropping it. But then the big suit happened. 3 of the big standards organizations sued us. Then there was a second suit, 3 more standards organizations. So we were sued for about 450 standards incorporated at the federal and state level. Massive suit. Now, all my lawyers work for free. They're all pro bono. But in 2015, we did 23 days of depositions and full discovery. 6 plaintiffs, 4 law firms on the other side. My side, EFF, their legal director, Corinne McSherry, and Mick Stoltz represent me. Fenwick and West has had a team of, at times, up to 10 lawyers on the case. You guys know what depositions are in U.S. courts? Oh my God, we did. So in 2015, my pro bono legal bill, I asked for a pro forma invoice. My pro bono legal bill was $2.8 million. We did 23 days of depositions, 3 days against me. And a day of deposition is a court videographer, a court stenographer, the other side, 6 lawyers. My side, 5 lawyers, and it's a 14-hour day. And the day consists of, they take a piece of paper, and they hand me a copy, they hand the stenographer a copy, they hand my lawyer a copy. That's Exhibit A1. Mr. Malamud, you recognize that. It's apparently a piece of email from 1998. Objection, my lawyers. We don't know if that's really Mr. Malamud doesn't know if that's his. He can't possibly remember back to 1998. Other side objects. We finally agree that perhaps I sent this email in 1998. Mr. Malamud, what does that email say? Please read paragraph 3. Why did you say that? And 14 hours of that. We had 3 days of that against me. They deposed my ex-wife. They deposed the Internet Archive. We deposed. I mean, it was just awful. It's U.S. District Court litigation. District Court judge said we were guilty. They said we were guilty, that the Edicts of Government doctrine that we were talking about, they said, you know, if Congress had wanted these standards not to have copyright, they would have said that. And the judge kind of went, you should be talking to that big White House up the hill. And she was pointing to the U.S. Capitol. This is the D.C. District Court. So we argued, look, even if you don't buy Edicts of Government, what about merger? Merger says there's only one way to express something. It can't be under copyright. There's only one way to express the law. There's only one way to say that a 30-ampere circuit must be 3 feet away from another 30-ampere circuit, right? You just can't say that different ways. Not merger. We argued much of the copyright was invalid. Registrations were invalid. Many of these were co-authored by federal employees. Works of government. Didn't buy that. We argued fair use. Now, fair use in the United States is a judicial determination, right? You have to look at something and say, I think this is fair. And you post it, and if the other side disagrees, they sue you. And then the judge looks at 4 factors. So one of the factors is, are you commercial or non-commercial? The judge ruled we were commercial because we got grants for doing our work. Okay, well that makes every nonprofit commercial when you think about it. The judge ruled that we were using all of the standard and had not transformed them in a useful fashion. And we argued that no, we retype many of these, we make them available to the blind, they're available in an EPUB format, you can read them on your cell phone. You know, we had transformed them, she ruled we had not transformed. And so a permanent injunction was put down on me for both trademark and copyright violation. And so all the standards were taken offline and we appealed. We went to the U.S. Court of Appeals and we just recently got a 3-0 decision. And the decision says a couple things. It says there is a constitutional argument. Freedom of speech, they recognize that the Edicts of the Government Doctrine exist, but they said, listen, that's a really thorny problem, and we're deferring on that one. We don't need to decide it. And the reason we don't need to decide it is because the court erred in not looking at fair use. And for example, this idea that we were commercial, the Court of Appeal said that's nonsense. And the court insisted that the district court now open up each of these standards and look at them and ask the question, what's in this standard? Because the Court of Appeal said there was just an insufficient paper record. What's in each of these standards? Was there market harm? Was it fair use? But it was a strong suggestion that what we were doing might be considered fair use. There was a concurring opinion by Judge Kansas, who was Deputy General Counsel for President Trump before he was elevated to the bench. And he said, in the unlikely event this is not fair use, we want this one back because it is inconceivable that people don't have the right to read and speak the law. So it was a victory for us, but it was one of those victories like you win the pie eating contest, but your prize is you get another pie that you have to eat. And so we're going back to the district court for probably a year. There's 450 standards that need to be examined. This will likely go back up to the U.S. Court of Appeals. Now, I had been posting standards not just for the federal government, but for all countries. I had begun doing them in Europe. We were convicted in a German court for the baby pacifier standard. You know, a baby soother with the baby suck. There was a safety standard online that was mandated in the official European journal as law of the land, and the German court just didn't buy our argument. We are going back in via Ireland to readdress that issue again in September. So this is how I get to India, and the rest of the talk will be focused on India. I had gone to see Anish Chopra in the White House. He was our first chief technology officer under President Obama. And because I had worked for John Podesta and I had been a consultant of the Obama transition, I knew a lot of these folks in the White House. And I went to pay the courtesy call on Anish, and he goes, so what are you doing these days? And I said, well, I'm posting these standards, and I understand that's probably not a fight you can do from the White House, but I thought you'd be interested. And by the way, I'm thinking of doing India. He goes, you need to go meet the CTO of India, Sam Pitroda, my colleague. And he goes, yeah, he's my colleague, but there's a big difference. And he said, listen, when we had the summit meeting with Manmohan Singh, there was this big room, and at one end of the room was Manmohan Singh, and at the other room edge was President Obama. And Anish Chopra is kind of way in the back with all the staff aides, right? Sam Pitroda was right next to President Obama. So he was CTO, but he was a member of the cabinet, and as you know, has a long history in India, was a senior cabinet minister under Rajiv Gandhi, and of course put a telephone in every village in India. So I called him up and I said, Pitroda ji, may I come see you? And so I went to see him, and I brought copies of Indian standards that I had scanned with my cover sheet on them, and he asked me some questions. He goes, so why do they assert copyright on these? And what kind of standards are we talking about? And I said, well, these are standards for the safety of pesticides, standards for agricultural irrigation, standards for firefighter safety, standards for textile factories, the National Building Code of India. And he goes, well, why aren't these available? And I said, well, the National Building Code of India costs 14,000 rupees, and the Bureau of India Standards asserts copyright. If you buy a PDF version, an electronic version, it's still 14,000 rupees, and it's got DRM protection on it, right? You can't copy it or do anything useful. And I said, I was thinking of posting these on the internet. And he goes, well, this is good. And I said, well, but Sam, and he was in the cabinet at the time. I said, but Sam, the Bureau of Indian Standards is going to be very annoyed. And he goes, I don't care. Go ahead. So I took all 19,000 standards. I spent $5,000 and bought the deluxe subscription service and put all 19,000 standards online. About 900 of them, we did the whole HTML SVG thing. This is wildly popular with engineering students in India because they used to have to go to the library, and there was a CD there, and they'd have to stand in line and pull it up and page through, and now it's there in HTML, it's on their cell phone, they can make a copy of it. They can pull the tables out and put it into software. When they assert copyright on these standards, that's not just, you can't copy the standards, you can't use the formulas and things without our permission in software that you're developing. So if you want to simulate energy efficiency according to the energy code, According to them, you're not able to do that. Somebody got sued for doing a construction with cement textbook that included excerpts from an Indian standard at the back, and he was sued by the Bureau for doing that. So I put all 19,000 standards online, and about a year later I got my renewal for my subscription service. And this is how I do things. I don't like sneaking around. I don't think that solves anything, right? I mean, one way to do it is you pirate it, you do it anonymously, you put it on BitTorrent. That's not my goal. My goal was to fix governance. And so I sent him a letter saying I would be delighted to renew my subscription. Here is a purchase order. And by the way, here's all your standards on the internet. Isn't this great? And by the way, we have all of these in HTML. Would you like a copy of the HTML? And the sales manager sent me a pretty pissed off note. Copyright violation, cease and desist. You must stop doing this. No more standards for you, sir. So I was cut off. What you do when you get something like that is you petition the government. So we put together a formal petition to the Minister of Consumer Affairs, Food Safety, and I think they have a third area that they're responsible for. And the petition had affidavits from senior professors of water engineering and transportation engineering in India. Sam did an affidavit. Vince Cerf, father of the internet, did an affidavit. We had intensive documentation of all the instances of Indian standards being used in regulations by the union and the state. We listed the 150 standards that are subject to mandatory certification, in which if you sell concrete or steel in India, you have to have it certified by the Bureau of Indian Standards. Interesting point, less than 2% of the revenues of the Bureau come from sales of standards. Almost all their revenue comes from certification revenue. That's the big money, right? Another 2% comes from the sales of international standards that are not Indian standards, which we don't care about. Those are not the law. But the Indian standards are developed in this incredible law-making process, right? There is a governing council that has 2 union ministers, 5 state ministers, 2 members of parliament, and a whole bunch of joint secretaries, permanent secretaries, additional permanent secretaries. That's the board. They direct 14 divisions, each one of which has a division council, many of which are chaired by a government employee. The standards are developed by engineers and professors that volunteer their time. They're not getting paid. The standards are issued as drafts. The public has a chance to comment. The comments are taken into account. The standard is approved by the governing council, and it is noticed in the official gazette. So after our petition was turned down, we filed a PIL, public interest litigation. My co-petitioners are Sushant Sinha, who runs Indian Canoon, and if you don't know about Indian Canoon, please go see it. An amazing thing he did. You know, he's a young computer science PhD that was working at Yahoo and wanted to give something back to his country, and he decided case law needed to be online, and so just as a side project he did it, and then he quit his job at Yahoo, which I'm sure was very well paid, and he now does Indian Canoon full-time. My other co-petitioner is Srinivas Kodali, who has been leading the charge against Aadhaar. He's not the only one leading that charge, but he's been very active, very good person. I'm going to see him in Hyderabad when I go there on Monday. And we are in front of the High Court of Delhi. Our lawyers, all working pro bono, are Nishith Desai and Associates, and our senior advocate is Salman Khurshid, former Minister of Law and Justice. And they've been really good about donating their time and learning the issues. And so October 9th, we're in front of the High Court for our oral argument. There's a new Chief Justice, so we're not sure. We were in front of the acting Chief Justice, and we had done several tries at oral arguments. Our problem was that the union government just failed to respond. So we went through 3 times in which the court convenes, and union government had not filed their response, and the Chief Justice says, is the union government here? And they weren't, and court adjourned. There was one instance that I remember in which there was a lawyer from the government there, and the Chief Justice says, are you there for the Bureau or the union government? And the lawyer stood up and says, I'm not sure, your ladyship. And so she sent him home to figure out who his client was. We convened for another 30 days. The Union government has now decided they are not going to respond, and so it's just the Bureau of Indian Standards that is the respondent at this point. We think we have a reasonable chance of succeeding. You never know, but we think there's at least a possibility. So that's what kind of got me interested in India again. I had been in India in the 90s. I finished my first book in the late 80s on a houseboat in Srinagar. His Holiness the Dalai Lama had written the foreword to one of my books, so I was in Dharamsala to present the copy to him. So I had been in India before. But after confronting the Indian government, I decided I really needed to spend a lot more time learning about what was going on here. So I bought all 3 volumes of Sirvai's Constitutional Law Treatise, and I've been reading that. I spent a lot of time looking at the history of Indian liberation. And because of things like my young friend Aaron Schwartz getting arrested, my getting sued, I did a deep dive into civil resistance. And so I spent a lot of time reading about Gandhiji and Nehru and Ambedkar and all the others that are the fathers of modern India. A lot of time reading about the civil rights struggle and Martin Luther King, Nelson Mandela. The question is, how do you confront authority in a way that makes sense? And Gandhiji has so much to teach us about that. Because remember, he was a lawyer and a publisher. That's what he began by doing. And he spent an awful lot of time in court litigating and petitioning governments. And so I was reading deeply about it, and I had become good friends with Sam. And Sam called me up one day, and I was visiting him. I went to visit him in San Francisco, where his grandkids are. And he's on his laptop, and he goes, "Do you have a stick?" I was like, "Stick? USB stick." And I said, oh. And so I handed him a USB drive, and he copies a bunch of data, and he hands it back to me. And I go, "So what's this?" 100 volumes of the collected works of Mahatma Gandhi, the electronic version. It's in beta. I said, "Oh, well, this is nice." And I said, "Well, so where'd you get it from?" "Sabarmati Ashram." I said, "Well, what are they doing with it?" "Well, they're going to put it on a website. They have a Gandhi portal. It's not quite ready yet. They're having some issues." I said, "Well, can I post it?" He goes, "Yeah, of course. I said, "Well, won't the ashram be annoyed?" Gandhi, go for it." And so, of course, I put it on the Internet Archive, and we got a long note from Dina Patel, who I've become very good friends with. Dina did the electronic version, and she was like, "Oh my God, what did you do? The works must be distributed in their entirety," and she had a series of guidelines. We have since had many talks about it. I'm actually totally impressed with the work she did on the collected works. But I figured since I had posted the collected works, I might as well keep going. So I began looking around. I found 129 All India Radio audio files of Gandhiji speaking in the last year of his life. Every 2 to 3 days, he would give a post-prayer meeting speech. And so I put those up on the Internet Archive, and I was able to pull the English translation of each of those speeches out, and I turned them into HTML, and I put it under the audio file, and I made the footnotes live. So you can listen to him speak, you can read the English translation, and then you can click back into the collected works. And you can see what letters he wrote that day, what letters he wrote the next day, what speech did he give after this, and you can literally just walk through the last year of his life. It's really an amazing thing. I found 59 volumes of the selected works of Nehru on a government server. But they were up to volume 69 by there. So I was able to take the ones off the government server. I bought all the books for the remaining ones. And we're now up to volume 73. So we have the most complete collection of the selected works of Nehru online. Same with the works of Ambedkar. Have a whole bunch of books by Radhakrishnan, Ramahan Roy, his letters. But as part of that collection, every time I'm in India, I go to the publications division. And I don't know if you know, but your publications division of the Ministry of Information is one of the largest publishers in India. And they have this amazing selection of books, photography books about the presidential palace, 50 volumes of biographies of the builders of modern India, books about the metalware of the Gujarati people, or the lamps of India, or how to wear a sari. And so every time I'm in India, I buy about 100 pounds of books from the bookstore. I put them in these big green bins, and I check them as luggage to bring home, and we scan those. I've got 34 books from the Archaeological Survey of India. So books that are financed by the public, that are meant to be available to the public. These books all have copyright assertions on them. Now, India has never sued someone for violating the copyright of the Publications Division. But you know how it is with doing something like this. If you're going to take this kind of an action, you have to be prepared to bear the consequences. So I hope I won't get sued. I think it would be silly to sue me over this. Our use is totally non-commercial. This is amazing material. Much of it is very old. Like our standards, many of the older books from the Publications Division, they don't sell anymore. And so I go on eBay and the Amazon market, and I look for all the used books. We have about 1,000 books in the Hinswal Raj collection. When I come to India, I put a copy of it on a little disk drive and I give it to people. And so whenever I'm at a university, I give it to the vice chancellor and I say, look, put this on your internal network. And so we're trying to have it not just on the Internet Archive, we're trying to replicate this data and make copies of it available throughout India. That's the Hinswal Raj collection. I'm going to talk about a couple other collections, and then I'm going to get to scientific knowledge, which is kind of the thing that really brings me to India on an ongoing basis. There was something called the Digital Library of India. Over a 10-year period, the government had 10 different scan centers, and they scanned 550,000 books. And I noticed that one day when I was sitting waiting for my flight home, and I was sick, and Sam was on the phone, and I kind of looked at this, and I wrote a little script, and I saw I was able to pull some books out. And so for about 6 months, I was able to suck about 440,000 of those books out of the Digital Library of India. A really bad server. It kept going down. The domain name service would get lost. But over time, if you just keep plugging away, you're able to get them. And so I put those books up on the Internet Archive. Now, here's what happened. They had been sloppy on copyright. Well, they had been scanning books that they shouldn't have been scanning, that really were in copyright. In copyright for general usage. Now, as you know, under the Indian Copyright Act, if a teacher is furnishing materials to a student, I'm going to get to that in just a second, that is an exception to copyright. But they had the Digital Library of India up for everyone. And because the Internet Archive is SEO optimized, people started to find their books. And they would write to us at the Internet Archive, and yeah, not a problem. I knew it was a little bit dirty, and so University of North Carolina Press wrote to us and said, you have 5 of our books, and we really appreciate you having done this, but we're starting to sell our back files, so would you mind? And so we not only removed those 5 books, I did a search and I found another probably 30 of their books that we had, and I removed those. And I said, oh, thank you very much, we appreciate it. Not a big deal. One person, however, found the books and just went ballistic with the Indian version. And said, you have my father's book online, and a crazy Russian guy. And just went totally nuts. And he knew some of the folks, at which point I guess they figured out that they had been sloppy on copyright. And so they took the Digital Library of India down. It's still down. It's been down for over a year. And they're going through and looking at each book and deciding whether it's in copyright or not. Well, here's what I did. I pulled all the metadata into a big spreadsheet, and I sorted it a whole bunch of different ways. So I sorted it by date. 1980 on. If it's the Gazette of India, it's fine. If it's the British Medical Journal, it's not fine. And so I just did a quick sort. And I was able to knock out probably 60,000 books that were very clearly in copyright. And so the government had insisted that I delete all the books immediately while they did their review. And I said, no, we're simply not going to do that. If you tell me which books are in copyright, I'm willing to look at your list. And they said, well, we're working on that. But I was able to remove a whole bunch. We haven't had any notices, any takedown notices in months, right? We've had over 20 million views on our copy. We now call it, by the way, the Public Library of India. We don't want to be confused with the government effort. So I made pains to distance ourselves from that and say, look, we're not part of the government, we're not affiliated with them. But we have 400,000 books that are spinning. There's probably a few in there that are still in copyright, and if anybody sends a takedown notice, then we'll gladly and happily remove them. So copyright is somewhat of a gray area in some ways, right? Particularly works of government. The things that are funded by the government are meant to be available. And so when you look at copyright on these issues, it's not a binary thing. A lot of people think that it is. but ultimately it's a fact pattern presented to a judge. And you have to look at it and ask yourself, should this information be more broadly available? And do I have a reasonable story to tell as to why it should be? One more project, and then I'm going to get to Saiha. The Gazettes of India. Sushant Sinha and I have, Sushant's written a crawler. The Gazettes of India are not very readily available. Many are online, but they're on servers that are really hard to work with. Many of them have CAPTCHAs, right, in order to do a search. Many of them are not full-text event. None of them are full-text search. And so I had begun taking the Union Government Official Gazette and putting it on the Internet Archive, and I went to Sushant, and he's written code that does about 15 of the states. So he writes the code, and then I do the crawling. And we now have about 300,000 PDF files, 3 lakh PDF files online, about 15 states. Some states are really good. Kerala does a wonderful job. Uttar Pradesh, we cannot find an online version of the Uttar Pradesh Gazette any place. That's 250 million people in that state. You'd think it would be online. But we're doing the ones we can. We are looking for law students to go knock on the doors of all the states and say, excuse me, do you sell CDs? Do you sell DVDs? How can we obtain this information? And the answer might be you have to go scan paper in a library, but I suspect Uttar Pradesh probably sells CDs. Big state, everybody's got to read the Gazette. So that's an area that we're kind of hoping we can get some student volunteers to maybe knock on some doors. Not a hard project. They may say, well, why do you want these? And it may take an RTI request in order to get them out, and they may deny the RTI, at which point then you have to go to court. So it's possible this may be more than simply knocking on a door. But I suspect some of the states, they'll just say, oh yeah, you can subscribe to DVDs and here's the price. And if that's the case, I will subscribe and we'll add those. We're going through those gazettes and we're doing stuff to fix them. Many of them forgot to embed the fonts, right? So if you don't have that font on your computer, all you get is nonsense. Some of the PDF files are broken. We're looking at advanced optical character recognition to actually get the text searchable. But even with the very rudimentary upload I've done, we've already had 1 million views on this collection because you can't go to the Union government and do a full text search of the gazettes. Whereas on ours, you can say, Vice Chancellor appointment Calcutta University, and I'll say, oh, here's the issue you want. I've also gotten a lot of the historical gazettes, which were in Digital Library of India or we found in other places. And so I've been adding those to the collection. So we're trying to get the Bombay Presidency Gazette, or Kerala State Library has the Fort St. George Gazette. So getting a lot of these historical materials online. So technical knowledge, knowledge about the history of India, a public library of India, those are some of the collections. The Delhi University copy shop case. You probably know about this, but I'm going to briefly go over it. So at Delhi University, if you're a student, your professor will assign journal articles to you, and there is a copy shop on premises. It's a commercial operation, but they're there at the invitation of the university, and they sell course packs. So the professor goes in and says, here's a list of my journal articles. The copy shop goes to the library, copies the journal articles, and then sells you course packs. They were raided by armed police. The guy who runs the copy shop was taken away and brought to jail. Cambridge University and Oxford University sued him for copyright violations. And it went to court. A third, Francis and Taylor, joined the litigation. And they said, this is a copyright violation. This is a blatant copyright violation. Lawrence Liang, Shamnad Bashir, several other very good intellectual property lawyers in India intervened on behalf of the students and the teachers. And they pointed out to the judge that there is an exception in Indian law that says if you are furnishing materials from a teacher to a student in the course of instruction, copyright does not apply. Case dismissed. Wasn't a copyright violation. I looked at that and I was very interested because I had been looking at copyright assertions in the US. I had been doing a study of works of the US government because a lot of federal employees author journal articles, right, in scientific journals. And I was curious because under the Works of Government clause, if it was in the course of their official duties, copyright does not apply. Not only that, Section 403 of the Copyright Act of the United States says that the portion that is not subject to copyright should be clearly identified. And I noticed President Obama had done an article in the Harvard Law Review, and the Harvard Law Review was basically asserting copyright over the thing. They had some wiggle room language that was quite creative about how they weren't copyrighting the words of the president, but the distinctive layout of the article was somehow subject to copyright. And I ran that by people like Pam Samuelson, who's on my board of directors, and she just rolled her eyes. And you know, so I thought to myself, I wonder how prevalent this practice was. So I had been doing an in-depth dive into the scholarly literature, and I found 1.2 million journal articles authored by federal employees. We pulled a statistically valid sample out by publisher and by agency and looked at each article, and we asked ourselves the questions, were these in the course of their official duties? Sometimes you can't tell, but sometimes it's a judge who thanks his clerk for working on the article with him and thanks his secretary for typing it up. That's probably official duties. A doctor at the National Institutes of Health publishing research results from his government laboratory, probably official duties. And so we looked at these 6,500 articles to say, is there any evidence of that? That's very hard to tell because you have to look in the biography, but in some cases there was evidence. But we also asked, was there the required copyright disclaimer on there? And almost none of the publishers say this is the work of the US government, including the American Bar Association. As part of that investigation, I had been using a system called Sci-Hub. Sci-Hub, a young lady named Alexandra Elkadian, I think I pronounced it right, was a Kazakhstan graduate student. She's Kazakh. And she was unable to access the journals she needed for her graduate work. And so she put together a system called Sci-Hub, which is running out of Russia. She's in hiding. It has 70 million journal articles on it. All human knowledge, if you consider scientific journals to be the bulk of human knowledge. Obviously books and other things are important, but you know, this is an important component of all human knowledge. Sci-Hub is a pirate site, there is no doubt about it. Alexandra was sued in the Southern District of New York. There's a $15 million judgment out against her. There's all sorts of court orders trying to remove the domain names. Despite that, it is wildly popular with students all over the world. India is the second largest user of Sci-Hub in the world. China is the largest. In the top 10, though, are the US and the United Kingdom. Because one of the things we found on our works of government analysis when we were looking for these 1.2 million articles is that students at the University of North Carolina didn't have access to a lot of this stuff. Harvard is cutting back on its journal acquisitions because they can't afford that. And in India, if you are a doctoral student in genomics or biology or zoology, you simply cannot access the material you need. And so I thought to myself, I wonder if Sci-Hub and the Delhi University fact pattern are similar. And so I talked to a lot of lawyers. And after thinking about it very hard, I took a deep gulp. And I took 16 8-terabyte drives, and I put them in a little briefcase, which weighed 19 kilos, and I brought them on the airplane with me to India, and I locked them away in a very safe location where they still are right now. And I went on the wire and I did an op-ed on who may swim in the ocean of knowledge. And my position is that Indian students shouldn't be going to a pirate site to get their materials. If it is legal under the teaching exemption of the Copyright Act, the vice chancellors and professors and deans should be making those materials available to the Indian students as part of their instruction. And what I said is that I wasn't going to use Sci-Hub, this copy of Sci-Hub, to build another pirate site. If you want to do that, go do it. Go do BitTorrent, whatever. I don't do things that way. I think that would be wrong, personally. I would much rather use the existing law to achieve that goal. So what I said in that op-ed is that I wasn't going to build a pirate site, but that I was going to attempt to figure out if there was a way to use this material in India. And I've been going to visit vice chancellors and professors and deans and lawyers and others. And we're talking about how to do this properly. And we think it is possible. We think it is legal under Indian law. Now, you never know it's legal until a judge has looked at a fact pattern. But this seems close enough to the Delhi University case. If you look at what Gandhiji did in India, he did more than the liberation of India. He set an example that decolonized the world. And today, knowledge has been commodified. It has been colonized. The TRIPS agreement was an attempt to make sure that high-priced intellectual property would be overly strictly protected, and the result has been a series of large Western corporations that have a monopoly over a lot of knowledge. In today's world, to me, scientists are the new indigo farmers, right? They produce their materials. Journals are the new railways. They ship these materials, ironically enough, most of them to a UK corporation, Reed Elsevier. They then get back these high-priced finished goods that they must purchase in order to grow more indigo. And it's this vicious cycle. To me, Sci-Hub is simply an unlicensed salt factory on the edge of the ocean of knowledge. What Alexandra has done is very brave. It is an act of civil disobedience, and she is in fact bearing the consequences of those actions. But what she has done is a Gyan Satyagraha, a knowledge Satyagraha. And what I'm trying to do with Sci-Hub is see if there's something we can do. To me, universal access to knowledge is the great promise of our generation and of the internet. It's something that is possible now that was not possible before. Access to knowledge is not necessarily going to fix all of the problems in our world, right? Our world today, increased violence, increased economic inequality that is growing and growing, disease, despite the fact that we have medicines that will cure their $1,000 pills and people are dying. 200,000 people dying of hunger in India, and India has a food surplus. Climate change is rampant, and yet we deny it. The President of the United States does not think climate change is real. And those are the real problems. But I put it to you that if you want to solve those problems, you need to do them in a way that we take control of our government. And in a democracy, a government is owned by the people, and that government only works if the citizenry is informed. Right? If you want to change economic inequality, one of the fundamental things you do is the right to an education. So some kid out in a rural village who wants to learn about computers ought to be able to use communications and knowledge to give themselves an education and to bootstrap themselves. And so it's a precondition to solving these bigger problems. It's a precondition if you believe that our government is not paying attention, if it's a government only for the rich, if you believe that biodiversity is important, but the Biodiversity Act has led to a bonanza for the seed companies in Monsanto, if you believe climate change is real, if you believe the pollution in India, in Delhi, for example, the pollution every October is just amazingly bad. Sitting outside in Delhi in October is like smoking 44 cigarettes every day. The only way we're going to solve that is to take control of our government. And that is an informed citizenry. And the question is, if you think universal access to knowledge is the promise of our generation, where do you start? And I believe the only place you can start that is in India. It's got to be a big, vibrant democracy. It's not going to be the United States. It's definitely not going to be Europe. I think it's got to be in India. And I developed that theme in this book, Code Swaraj, that I co-authored with Sam Petroda. With a title like Code Swaraj, obviously there are no rights reserved on the thing. It's online, public.resource.org/Swaraj. And if you go there at the back of the book, there's a table of links. And that table of links has pointers to the Hind Swaraj collection and the gazettes in the Public Library of India. So I believe, like I said, that access to knowledge is the promise of our generation. And it's a promise of the internet, but it's an unrealized promise, right? The internet has to be more than WhatsApp and video games and new internet billionaires. It has to be something where knowledge is available without walled gardens, where you have control over your code, where it isn't some corporation that tells you what you're allowed to do on your computer. And that's a fight that I think is going to take a long time. It's not going to be an instant result, but we have to begin someplace. And I am beginning in India, and I hope you'll join me. So thank you very much. I would be more than happy to answer questions.
My name is Darshan, and you just spoke about Sci-Hub, right? And the requirement for free access to information that has been published. But when we think about it in terms of the journals that do publish these articles, they do need a source of revenue to keep up the quality of these publications in their journals. Because if we were to have a system where anybody could indeed publish whatever they wanted online, that would lead to a drop in the quality of the publications with regard to their, say, being peer-reviewed and things like that. So,
no, I get that point. I totally get a couple points there. First of all, there is a new model of publishing high-quality journals. Much of the peer review and the editing is done for free. Remember, they're not paying these professors to do the editing and to do the peer review. I don't think journals cost nearly as much as some of these very high-priced corporations charge. Reed Elsevier has a gross margin, a profit margin, bigger than Google's. This is intensely profitable for them. So I don't think it costs nearly as much. I think there's alternative paths. I also believe many of these publishers have over-asserted copyright, right? They have things that they know are not validly under copyright, that they have the only copy of that they keep inside of a paywall. They've engaged in predatory pricing. There are certain journal articles that are very rare, but if you need it for your study, right, they will charge you market rate. And I've seen charges of $5,000 for a single journal article. So they have to go back to their funders and say, I spent $5,000, but I really need this paper. And so yes, but I think the balance has shifted. I think it has shifted so much on the side of money, so much on the side of obscene profits, of over-assertions, that the publishers have lost the moral ground. And I think that's particularly true with the non-profit scholarly societies like the American Chemical Society. Again, many of them are paying obscene salaries to their CEOs, have built huge infrastructure. They need to adjust to the reality of the internet, just like every other business sector has adjusted and changed the way they do business. And many of these folks have not, and they've not done that in an attempt to hold on to revenues. And even Reed Elsevier in their annual report has admitted the world is changing. They're not going to be able to keep this up forever. And the question is, can we accelerate that change? So yes, they deserve money, but not as much as they're getting.
So my question relates to how we view technology, and it's a bit of a comment and a question for you as well. When we talk about the political economy of technology, we tend to view technology as something that is fixed or something that isn't necessarily influenced by our own economy, our own society, our own politics. And on the other side, we view these three things in different compartments. We view our politics and our economies as something that is affected by technology, but not necessarily something that builds it. And again, through the course of your lecture, I seem to see that technology or the kind of technology, stagnant choices that have already been made or technical solutions that have already been implemented rather than political choices that we make and can implement in our economy, in our society, in our laws, right? What is your opinion on that side of the debate, on actually shaping technology through our political choices rather than building technology and then letting our policies catch up to that later? Yeah.
So I do not believe in technological determinism. I've spent 40 years working on computer networks and databases, and the change has been dramatic. I'm also a student of the history of technology. I am also a firm believer in you make the world you want to see, to paraphrase Gandhiji. There were two different internets in the 1980s. There was the Internet Engineering Task Force, which is based on open standards, and one of the lessons we learned in the IETF is there was always somebody smarter than you out there that you didn't know, right? And when you put the standards online, magic would happen. The other vision of the Internet was based on a smart telephone network and a set of protocols called Open Systems Interconnection, OSI, which was developed by the International Standards Organizations and Big Telco. And they had these very high-priced standards. It was very much a centralized system rather than end-to-end network. And we won. I'm sorry, their network failed. But everybody thought, including many governments, that the world was going to be based on OSI and a smart telephone network. And when you see things like SMS, texting, that costs, in the US 20 cents per text, that was their vision of the world, is that you would have a menu and everything you did would cost money. Our vision of the world was an end-to-end network in which all the smarts were on the edge. And so if you want to run a HTTP Apache server on your MacBook Air, you can do that. And in fact, I have done that. And I think you can shape the world. I think Sci-Hub is actually rapidly evolving. It really isn't a single choice. The world of publishing is rapidly evolving. When people ask me about standards, senior policymakers, members of Congress, and they say, well, why do these SDOs do that? I like to be charitable, and I say, in the 70s or 80s, it made sense to sell a $20 document. It cost them money to make them, they had to print them. With the internet, that's not necessary. They just haven't kept up. And more importantly, they've gotten greedy. So what used to be a $20 document is now a $500 document, or a $1,000 document. And the same thing with these journals. The prices are going up at 20, 30, 40% every year. They try to bump the price up. And the librarians are spending huge amounts of money. Many libraries simply have been cutting back, like Harvard. Libraries, if you go to, just picking a random example, Rajasthan Central University, I suspect they don't have access to all the journals they need for the programs that they teach. And I think that's something we need to change. Be the change you want to see. And that's for real in our work.
Knowledge, but in a country like India where technology still is at premier stages, not accessible in the rural areas or to a large chunk of people. So how do you plan to evolve that? Because just limiting the scope to technology is depriving all those people from the benefits that we as a privileged class are benefiting from. So how do you plan to if you have one, how do you plan to disseminate information to the rural areas or the people who cannot directly access technology?
So, fallow, right, that should be more broadly available. On the other hand, I spent a lot of time talking to people about policy in general. A friend of mine is Bunker Roy, who runs Barefoot College in Tolonia. I was just talking to Vandana Shiva in Delhi. I think that's a crucially important issue. I believe government needs to think very strongly about universal. When I say universal access to all human knowledge, I don't just mean people in Delhi that have a fast internet link. I mean everybody in the world. And I think you need to do these things in parallel. I think one of the ways you can convince government ministers that this is something they should really be thinking about is you do something that touches home with them. So for example, if you're trying to convince a bureaucrat in government that this is important, getting all the gazettes online, that's something they look at every single day, might open their eyes a little bit and say, oh, okay, maybe it doesn't have to be piles of paper. Maybe by doing things like a public library of India, we can go back to the government and say, listen, this has to be available to all of India. There was a plan to move fiber optic out into all the villages, to have unlicensed spectrum, to have cheaper telephone, and we've ended up with things like that Facebook.org, fiasco in which it was an upsell. You got a dumbed down version of the internet, and they were trying to sell you more versions, and luckily that got beat back. But again, informed citizenry. If you think the internet needs to be every place, if you think communications is a human right in today's world, we need to begin pushing that. And I think you need to push that on many fronts. And so I work in a very small subset of the world. In the US, I didn't do network neutrality. I know a lot of people that did. But that wasn't the area I was working in. And I find that as someone who runs a small NGO, I've got to focus. I can't boil the ocean. I need to be aware of everything else that is out there, and I try to meet everybody who's involved in all the different components. But it's also important that rather than simply standing up and saying the world must be different, that you have a significant part of the world you're working in that you're going to make different, right? And actions and doing are what really change how government works. And I think you have to do that as well as being aware.
Lena has a question for you. How does one balance the interests of letting people control their data and lack of knowledge regarding potential consequences of the same? For example, giving data for certain benefits or insignificant money.
That's a really hard one. So one of the reasons I focus on things like books from the publications division is for that I don't have to deal with some of those issues. When I put the courts online, on the other hand, I had to deal with all sorts of issues of, court judgments must be public, but inside of that are names of minor children or information that maybe you should have the right to decide whether it's public or not. That's a really core issue. So for the courts, I remember addressing the Ninth Circuit of the U.S. Court of Appeals. It was a business meeting, but the chief judge, Judge Kaczynski, invited me to address it. It was all the judges. And they were asking me issues about, well, what about privacy problems and PACER and all that? And I said, listen, here's the problem. I'm putting this data online, and I'm having to make the ethical judgment about whether this opinion is available or not available. That's your job, Your Honors. You should be making that ethical judgment. But there is one thing I can tell you, that if the information is available in one of these commercial silos, where if you have a credit card, you can get that, that shouldn't be the determination, right? If something is available to people with money, it should be available to people without money. And if it shouldn't be available, then it shouldn't be available. And I think Aadhaar is a great example of society beginning to look at that issue in great depth. I think Aadhaar may have been a good idea when it was thought of. The idea of getting benefits out to the farmers, great idea. Now, they hadn't thought about the fact that they were doing fingerprint authentication, but if you work in the fields all day, you don't have a fingerprint anymore. They hadn't thought about the idea that Aadhaar for the benefit distribution required an internet connection. And in many places, Joan Draves did a piece in the Economic and Political Weekly about how what they would do is they would go on the roof with the cell phone to try to do the authentication. And this lady, like half the time, just didn't get her benefits because they were unable to get an internet link and get her authenticated. Aadhaar has been implemented in a way that, public-private partnerships, very sloppy cybersecurity, not paying attention to the rights of individuals to control their own information. It's a disaster right now. Hopefully, something will happen to fix that. So it's an incredibly tough balance. And it's something that we have to figure out how to solve. And, Facebook is a great example of, who gets to control your information. I'm not on Facebook. First of all, I think the interface is ugly. And secondly, I don't like the idea that Facebook is controlling, all this information and throwing ads in front of me from Russians and whatever it is that they're doing. So I haven't been on Facebook since 2008.
During the after he died. So I have a question which is slightly related. So you talked about how India is a fertile ground for dissemination or universalization of knowledge. And so what I want to ask is, what do you suggest we do to bypass these tables? Do you start something like cyber? Would we hook a hard drive?
Okay, the first part of your question again.
So you said that how India is a fertile ground due to the exemption corporate laws. How India can be the fertile ground for starting a movement in which we can universalize knowledge or give universal access to knowledge, at least in our country. So what do you suggest we do regarding that? Do you want us to do something like what Aaron Scott did, like hook up a hard drive to JSON and download all the documents which are available for free or something like that? Is there any legal way?
Okay.
Obviously there's a legal way, but...
So I want to make 2 points. Went very, very hard about it. He was willing to bear the consequences, and the consequences were horrible. When he downloaded those JSTOR articles, the U.S. attorney really went after him. All those felony charges, he was going to have to serve time in jail. The U.S. attorney was convinced he was going to put those on the internet. I don't think Aaron was going to do that, because that's not how Aaron worked. First of all, when Aaron didn't post databases. He came to people like me or Bruce DeCao or others we did the posting, not him. More importantly, he had done a study, downloaded a bunch of articles from West, and what he had demonstrated was corruption in the funding of scholarly journals for law professors. So law professor gets money from Exxon, writes an article in a journal, and then testifies as an expert witness on behalf of Exxon. So he had uncovered that. It was a very good article. And he had told my friend Clay Johnson that what he was trying to do was to download articles to look for evidence for climate change research. And that sounds much more like it. Now, I'm sure Aaron would have wanted that data to be public at some point, but that wasn't why he had done the download. I get people all the time coming to me, like on most of the US government, and saying, oh, I'll just go to IEEE and download everything. It's like, that's not how you do it. That's not how you do it. And if you do that, again, Gandhiji is a really good example on that. You know, Satyagraha isn't simply saying, hey, everybody, let's make salt, right? It began with an intense process of educating himself. He brought many people together, they thought about it, they worked on it, and so it was 80 people that thought about it for a month, and then when they went to walk to the sea, they began to be joined by many others. And so it's not a lone wolf thing, right? You have to be able to convince others. One of the first things that he did before Gandhiji left the ashram, he sent a letter to the viceroy saying, I'm going to go make salt. And, you know, Gandhiji learned about petitioning the government from Gokhale. And Gokhale said the reason we petition our government is to warn our rulers and to educate ourselves, right? So you have to begin by educating ourselves. Now, what can we do in India? I think the big thing we can do is activate the teaching exemption to copyright. Make all knowledge available in Indian universities. We can do that. We can do it under the Indian Copyright Act. We can do it under the Berne Convention. The teaching exemption is illegal. Let's begin there and do that. So that's one thing we can do, and that's a broad-based thing. That requires a lot of people working. The other thing we can do is look for data that is available, but not available in a better fashion, and expose it better, like the Gazettes of India. We've got a series of projects on biodiversity and traditional knowledge. There's a database called the Traditional Knowledge Digital Library, which is developed at great government expense. They scanned a whole bunch of ancient books about Ayurvedic medicine and Unani, and they typed it all in. And it's this public domain database, but it's only available to patent examiners, right? It's not available to the public. So one of the things I'm doing is I'm looking for law students. I'm working with various professors and a whole variety of people like Bala Pisupati, who's run the National Biodiversity Authority. And we're trying to figure out, is there a way we can petition the government to make the Traditional Knowledge Digital Library available? So looking for things that the government doesn't have available that could be, and then doing that limited action to try to solve that problem. And again, that's not a one-day thing, right? That starts with an RTI, and then maybe there's a petition, and then maybe you have public interest litigation. So you have to pick one thing that you decide is important and focus on it. Become an expert. Learn about it. Write letters. Get other people to join you in that effort. And then make that one thing available. And that's how you begin to have change. And again, I think we can do that in India for a whole bunch of reasons. Long tradition of access to knowledge, a distrust of $1,000 pills when people are dying and could have been cured with those, a very good Copyright Act, the strongest Freedom of Information Act in the world. RTI is by far the strongest. It is constitutionally based. A long experience of talking over difficult issues, sometimes talking over them too long, but in India, if you have a difficult issue, we're willing to discuss it. And that's why I think India is a place to start. But again, pick one piece, and then work on it, become an expert on it.
Based on support from other people, like you said, all your lawyers are pro bono. Do you look for support and then do an act, or do you do an act and then the support comes later?
Oh, I guess I do both. I would never do anything without talking about it to a lot of people. So the first thing I do when biodiversity is particularly sensitive in India, right? If you want to like open up TKDL so that Monsanto can patent a whole bunch of stuff. so I go talk to a lot of people to try to understand. So yes, I do go look for support first. Now, I don't say, will you come in with me and do it? I say, please teach me what I need to know. What are the issues here? What should I learn? And then ultimately, it's my decision whether I act. I'm particularly sensitive of, I don't want volunteer students coming in with me on something that's potentially dangerous. And so as a general rule, when it comes to the data liberation efforts, I do those myself. Things like do an RTI request or, go talk to the Uttar Pradesh, because that's not very dangerous. And so I don't like working with volunteers. You, and then there's one in the back.
Okay. The aspects of the judgment was that the interpretation of the course of instruction should be both institutionalized and non-institutionalized. So, I have a problem with the non-institutionalized aspect of it because it is a very wide aspect and there are a lot of things which come under it. For example, if you can circulate notes through your mobile phone or through similar devices like tablets, which directly amounts to infringement of copyright of the publishers if you're doing it without the permission, the non-institutionalized part. So don't you think that the publishers will suffer huge losses after, and people will tend to refer to those notes only and not to, buy their actual publications. So don't you think that it'll be really...
Well, let me unpack that. So the notes are not necessarily copyrighted. Let's just say that it's... So, look, non-institutional education is important because education should not necessarily be confined just to people that can afford to go to a nice university like this. You notice when I talk about Sci-Hub, I am talking strictly within the institutional framework of universities. So if I want to begin with the teaching exemption, I would begin here. I do believe it's important to do non-institutional education. I think people ought to be, as a so-called independent scholar, right, I'm not in a university, I have tremendous difficulty accessing the materials I need to do my work. Publishers and significant losses, I'm not sure I buy that. There's a couple things that are important to understand. For almost all publishing, you get all your money right away. Right? The long tail really doesn't exist. You're not getting a lot of money off that. If you look at the way rock and roll worked, you could go to the concert and hear it, and then you go out and buy the record. And so, maybe by making it available for non-commercial use only in an institutional framework, people are going to, maybe it'll increase sales. I found that with the SEC documents. When I put those online, there was a $300 million a year industry selling SEC documents. And the industry went nuts. They just thought this was the worst thing in the world. It was socialized, government information. After I shoved it back down the SEC's throat, I had the president of Disclosure come up to me and said, you know what? We ended up making more money. And the reason was people would come on our service and they'd use it, but if they got serious about being an investment professional or a day trader, they wanted the professional service that had all the SEC documents and they had the Japanese version and they had a better search engine and all that. I think the job of the publishers is to stay ahead of what's easy to do. They need to do the hard thing. So they need to have better books, right? They need to have faster books. They need to better books. I don't think they're going to suffer great losses. I just think it's a shift in the way the world works. And I think they need to adjust just like we need to adjust. Question back here?
Privacy is still a major source of accessing data for many people. So what are your ideas about changing this trend?
Give that one to me one more time.
Even after seeing that there is many legit sources of accessing data, it is a general trend that piracy is also used for accessing the data. So what are your ideas about changing this trend?
Well, there's two things happening. The main thing that's happening is that there's obviously a demand for this information. There's also people that are trying to make money without doing the right thing, right? But there's clearly a demand for that information. So I think that means that we have a problem. So for example, the piracy of the textbooks in India, right? The government has textbooks and you can download them off the government site, but it's not available to a lot of people. And so publishers take those and then they pirate them and they sell them and they make a lot of money. That shows that the government is not distributing those free textbooks in a very effective way. So piracy to me is a symptom that something is wrong. If you have so many people using Sci-Hub, something is drastically broken out there. And you can't just ignore it and say, pirates. It's 100 million people. It's students in India and China that can't get an education otherwise. We need to address those problems. So I think the way you solve piracy is you have a better solution. It's like the way you solve, people are worried that if the works of Gandhi Ji are not available with PDF protection, bad people will, bastardize the works of Gandhi. They'll come up with fake Gandhi. And that by PDF protecting it, somehow you're going to stop that from happening. And I don't think that happens, right? Pirates know how to break PDF. They know how to remove watermarks. If they want to do fake Gandhi, they will. I think the way you solve that problem is by having a better website, right? And being the place where if you want to know whether Gandhi said this or not, well, you know that the Gandhi portal will have the accurate thing. Same thing with the government. I was told that posting free law online was a bad thing because people would have fake Supreme Court judgments. And that, of course, has never happened out in the wild. I've never seen anybody do that, but yeah, it's a possibility. But my answer, and this was the American Association of Law Librarians, were saying you shouldn't be doing free law because there's no integrity to the data. I said, well, look, then the answer is that the government needs to have, digitally signed versions of their opinions online. And if you have any doubt whatsoever, like if you're a lawyer about to file on that, go double check on the real sites. But you shouldn't be prohibiting people from speaking the law in a democracy.
Question to you is that once the GDPR came into play, many businesses stopped giving their services to EU citizens. So what happens if many journals and information databases stop giving their services to Indian students when we go with this proposition?
That would be a moral crime on their part. So GDPR, by the way, they don't make them available to European citizens, but because they're lazy, they also don't make them available to other places. So in India, you may have run across I'm sorry, this is not available because Belgium can't have it. Again, that's government needs to fix that situation. Not making scientific information available is a moral crime. I'm sorry. I could see that was the latest Tom Clancy novel that perhaps you can decide where you want to sell it or not sell it for a limited period of time. And people seem to remember that copyright, is a limited period of time in order to have an incentive to do work. It's not an infinite, I own this forever. And copyright, again, has kind of gone over the edge with the length of the terms, even in India with the Tagore Amendment to the Copyright Act. The terms get longer and longer. I think the solution to scientific information has not become available in India is the professors and the vice chancellors and the deans all over the world need to say we are not going to publish our information with a publisher that is doing stuff like that. This is a public trust. I don't care if you're commercial or if you're a scholarly society. If you're doing a scientific journal, you're engaged in a public trust, and there are certain standards of behavior that society must enforce, either through government or through grassroots actions by the people that actually produce that information.
Grassroots level support for these sort of initiatives is that people are afraid that if they run a crawler on some sort of government entity, that the government will indeed bring their full legal might upon that person. And in your case, you might be able to defend yourself with very good lawyers who will support you, but these people will be left alone without any defense. So how do you suggest that people try to overcome this barrier to try and help the movement?
So, up at a hackathon, it says, I'm going to launch a whole bunch of crawlers and bring the server down. You got to look at the data, you got to figure out, what's going on, are there national security implications, is it truly public data like the Gazettes, is there sensitivity, and then you have to write a proper crawler and be prepared for the consequences. Now look, the idea that the government's going to arrest you for crawling a website, if you've done it moderately, right? Obviously if it's a denial of service attack, then that's different. You're not actually crawling it, you're bringing the server down. You're probably going to have a problem with that. But if you're doing it moderately, I just don't see how you could have an issue. One of the things we don't have in India is what we have in the US, Electronic Frontier Foundation. And so if people do in fact do a principled crawl of the government and run into issues with the authorities, they can turn to EFF for legal defense. In India, it's a little more hit or miss. There's also not a strong clinic program in India for this kind of work. There are clinics that do access to justice for the poor and things like that. but there isn't the equivalent of things like the Samuelson clinics. So I mean, you need to be careful, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. You know, there's people all over India doing this kind of work, and they just need to be careful. And again, think before you do something, and have enough technical skills so you don't bring the whole server down. The easy answer is get one document at a time. What people often will do is write crawlers that go in, 20 simultaneous things. I always do one at a time. Even on the Digital Library of India, I was running only a half dozen crawlers, but only after 6 months, and I noticed that really nobody was home, and I was the only user on the system. But I began with one PDF file, then one PDF file, and I monitored it very carefully to see what we were doing. You got to be careful. A lot of that's education. A lot of that is lawyers and engineering students beginning to commingle and learn. The engineering students need to learn the law, particularly on public access. Lawyers need technical skills, so there needs to be more of that.
Alright, I just wanted to take a moment to thank Mr. Malwood for coming down all the way to NLS and giving this beautiful lecture to us. And I just wanted to share a bit of an insight as to how much effort he's taken to put this talk together. What I really appreciated about what Mr. Malwood has done is that he actually places these, like on LTech, we try and work very hard to get people down so that students get a chance to interact with them. And we always run into a lot of trouble with finally getting them down here and making the time for them to come speak to us. And what I loved about interacting with Mr. Malwood was that he was 100% committed to coming here and speaking to you all. And he made sure that he came down to India, and he was very liberal in scheduling the talk as well. And I think that's in keeping with his entire vision as a public advocate, that this sort of information, this sort of knowledge needs to be engaged with. And the way he's come over here and actually done about this entire event, I think that speaks volumes as to how much he cares to keep the message flowing and ensure that people become a part of the movement. And I'd really like to thank him for all of his trouble to come here and speak to us. And just as a small token of our appreciation, we put together a parcel from the Vice Chancellor, who unfortunately is traveling, so he couldn't be here today.
Thank you so much. Thank you.